Welcome everybody, bienvenidos to this wonderful occasion, which is a celebration of Sandra Cisneros' most recent and wonderful book, Martita, I Remember You, Martita, Te Recuerdo. So we're gonna go back and forth, English and Spanish. For those of you who are bilingual, it'll be double the fun. For those of you that are monolingual, you'll catch on, all right? So I'm gonna introduce Sandra and Liliana in Espanol, and they're gonna grace us with a little reading. But let me just read the official bios and then we'll hear these wonderful voices. Sandra Cisneros nació en Chicago, internacionalmente aclamada por su obra de poesía y ficción, que ha sido traducida a más de 25 idiomas. Ella ha recibido numerosos premios, incluyendo la Medalla Nacional de las Artes, el Premio PEN Nabokov y una beca del MacArthur Foundation. Liliana Valenzuela ha traducido obras de Sandra Cisneros, Julia Álvarez, Denise Chávez, Cristina García, Gloria Saldúa y muchos otros escritores. En 2006 recibió el Alicia Gordon Award for Word Artistry and Translation. Como poeta, su poemario bilingüe más reciente es Codex of Love, Bendita Ternura. Por favor, help me welcome Sandra y Liliana.
Gracias, Rigoberto. Thanks.
Gracias.
Hello, everyone. So happy to be here.
Gracias to everyone who invited me. Several people, Melanie Fleischman and Sandra, everyone, gracias. Nice to be here. Am I supposed to start now, Rigoberto?
Ándale, tú dale.
Directions.
Como quieras.
Con la lectura primero.
Ándale. Okay, I'm going to read a selection that Lily is going to follow with, that she has translated. And it explains itself. I don't need to tell you very much. I'm waiting for something to happen. Something always happens in Paris. Paris with its chandeliers and palaces. Paris of champagne and moon. I'm waiting for something bigger than my life. A letter from the Côte d'Azur. All my life I've been waiting. In Chicago, it's winter too, and it's cold like here. My father is coming home from work with tacks stuck to the bottom of his shoes and tufts of cotton lint all over his sweater and in his hair. There's a hole in his pocket from his hammer. There's a sofa with its stuffing undone sitting on wooden horses and scraps of fabric on the floor. There's a floral chintz taped to the window to keep out the eyes of people who pass. My father is sweeping up scraps and sofa stuffings and the long cardboard strips with staples, the staple gun and the air gun dangling from curly coils overhead. My father is hand sewing a cushion with a long curved needle, or he is working a sewing machine, or his mouth is full of tacks and his little hammer is saying, tack, tack, tack. When I was a girl, I was always left speechless whenever my father put a handful of tacks in his mouth, as if he was a sword swallower or a fire eater. I'd put a tack in my mouth when he wasn't looking, and then spit it out. Tack, 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 says his hammer. My father hums or mutters my mother's name over and over like a man drowning.
Gracias, Sandra. So now, en español, estoy esperando a que algo suceda. Algo siempre sucede en París. París con sus candelabros y sus palacios. París del champán y de la luna. Estoy esperando algo más grande que mi vida. Una carta de la Côte d'Azur. He estado esperando toda mi vida. En Chicago también es invierno y hace frío, como aquí. Mi padre está llegando a casa del trabajo con tachuelas pegadas a las suelas de sus zapatos y pelusa de algodón por todo el suéter y el cabello. Tiene un agujero en el bolsillo para el martillo. Hay un sofá con todo el relleno desbaratado sobre caballetes de madera y retazos de tela en el piso. Hay una cretona estampada de flores pegada a la ventana con cinta de enmascarar para impedir que la gente que pasa mire adentro. Mi padre está barriendo los retazos y el relleno de sofá y las tiras largas de cartón con grapas, la engrapadora y la pistola de aire caliente colgadas de cables en espiral del techo. Mi padre está cosiendo a mano un cojín con una aguja curva y larga, o está cosiendo a máquina, o tiene la boca llena de tachuelas y su pequeño martillo dice tac, tac, tac. Cuando era niña, siempre me quedaba boquiabierta cada vez que mi padre se ponía un puñado de tachuelas en la boca, como si fuera un tragasables o un tragafuegos. Me ponía una tachuela en la boca cuando él no estaba mirando y luego le escupía. Tac, 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 dice su martillo. Mi padre tararea o masculla el nombre de mi madre una y otra vez como un hombre que se ahoga.
Gracias, Lily. So beautiful to hear it in Spanish.
Yeah, this is mi primera pregunta, Sandra, para ti. My first question for you is, your response to the translation, because your writing is so poetic. And I just want to hear your response hearing this in español.
Pues, Lily's a poet too, so I don't have to worry. If it was anybody else, I would have to truly be a little bit, have a little anxiety. But Lily, how long have we worked together? Like over 30 years?
Yes, yeah, I think 35 now. I
think so. Yeah, I remember when I first met you in that afternoon, and we didn't know we were going to be working together so closely, but we are. And basically, I knew you as a poet, and I think that makes all the difference. Whether you're translating or writing fiction or writing any other genre, because you write several genres like I do. That's the basis for everything. I think poetry is the hardest of all the genres. And if you conquered that, it's like you're starting with ballet before you go off to study jazz.
Well, I read it in both English and Spanish. And I can tell you that I fell in love with these three women in both languages.
Qué lindo.
Sí, me enamoré de las dos en los dos lenguajes. But I wanted to ask you, about this, reading this novel that takes me back to a different time, in a time when there was a level of danger and a level of risk, especially for women to travel and to journey through these spaces. Explícame un poco cómo fue para ti recordando o visitando, regresando a esa época.
Okay, I will tell you in English, and because that's my first language, and then I'll translate. Well, I think it's still dangerous for women to travel. It's dangerous to go get your car from the parking garage. It's dangerous to go to a public bathroom because you don't know if someone's hiding. I always kick the door down like some karate expert, when I go into a bathroom that's way by itself. And I mean, I'm like this for a reason. I don't want to make people think I'm paranoid, but I've just learned too many things of stories that women have told me of women being violated in churches in the daytime, in places like you would never imagine, and things that happened to me when you let your guard down, including in my travels or in my life. So I don't think the situation has gotten easier for women. I think, maybe it's difficult like that for gay men too. And I think you would understand in a way that maybe it doesn't surprise you to hear all this. I think for trans people, it's the same. This is any time when you're not somewhere where someone can hear you say help, it's scary. And going back to this story, it came to me, a lot of the things that the women say didn't just happen in my memory, but the memories of many women who shared their stories with me, and I put them in these three. Ahora a ver si lo puedo decir totalmente en español. Quiero decir que los tiempos no han cambiado para mujeres, que seguimos en unos tiempos que son difíciles, peligrosos para mujeres, pero también tanto como gente transexual, gente gay, inmigrantes, inmigrantes, cualquier persona que sea vulnerable, niños, si tienes que tener un terror de estar en un lugar donde no te pueden escuchar si necesitas ayuda. Y yo siento que es una fact, ¿no? No del pasado, sino de la vida actual, de la inhumanidad de la humanidad. Y intenté cuando escribí novela o novelita o cuento recuperar las historias, las anécdotas que las mujeres me compartían. Así que todas las historias que incluyo en este cuento no me pasaron todas, a mí muchas, pero no todas, porque por una razón u otro, las mujeres con quien me encontré en mis viajes les gustaban compartir sus secretos conmigo y los puse en las bocas de estas 3 mujeres.
Claro. Y creo que es importante esa narrativa porque cada vez que voy para Europa y me dice gente, oh, te recomiendo esto, te recomiendo lo otro, y yo pienso, bueno, no soy como muchos que nomás puede viajar así en las calles como si nada. Existe
Right.
discriminación, me ven como, me ven como mexicano, me ven como árabe, o me ven, y con esa, claro, y ya cuando te conocen así, ya el encuentro es muy diferente. Right?
Pero sí, eso, lo que dijiste, porfa.
I mean, once you are pegged as something else, all of a sudden you become a different kind of threat. For me, I always get Arab, or you're an Arab. And what does it mean to be Arab in Europe at the moment, right? Claro, claro. And Liliana, I wanted to ask you, sort of on the same route here. For you, it's like, translating these lives, these incredible journeys of these women, you really captured, the kind of, there was melancholy in it. There was a melancholy, un nivel de tristeza, pero también ese deseo, estas mujeres querían alcanzar algo grande, algo más. Y creo que ese deseo se comunica muy bien en español también. Y quería hablen un poco de eso, por favor.
Bueno, quizás Lili puede
sí, Lili.
Conmigo, Lili, as the translator, that comment that Rigoberto just made about there being sadness and desire. And I wonder if it's in the both languages. What do you say, Lili?
Yeah, the interesting question, Rigoberto, because I think I could relate a lot to that story on a very personal level. Me identifiqué mucho con esta historia.
¿En serio? Tú nunca me dijiste eso. You never told me.
No. Sí, pues como mujeres latinas, like traveling that we both did in our 20s, 30s, traveling through different countries where we were not expected to be or supposed to be. Que no se suponía que teníamos que viajar solas, sobre todo.
Diles a los que escuchan, ¿dónde fuiste y cómo?
Sí, o sea, yo fui a África cuando conocí a Sandra. I had just come back from Africa, from West Africa, traveling by myself. And so we were sharing stories, intercambiando impresiones y de cómo era, ¿no? Porque siempre it's always the men who travel and the men who go off to conquer the world. And so we were trying to do something similar in our own small way, excuse me, and not knowing really how to do it, and fending for ourselves y defendiéndonos como podíamos. Y me acuerdo que una vez en París, venía yo con una amiga y nos encontramos otros mexicanos y dijeron, ¿están viajando solas? Y nosotras, no, estamos viajando juntas. No, pero vienen solas. No, estamos juntas, estamos acompañadas. Y era como que, it's like if another woman is with you, that doesn't count traveling in Paris because you're still alone. Even 2 women are still alone and can still be prey to any advance or any situation where you have to defend yourself. So there was like a nostalgia, going back to your question, Rigoberto. that's a good description of it, because it's like looking back and wondering like, wow, we really did that. And there were all these women and all these people traveling, a lot of people from Latin America, because I think people think of Paris and they never think that there's like a lot of people from Latin America traveling as best they can, how they can, with like almost no resources, y defendiéndose, arreglándoselas como pueden, viajando por Europa, todos los latinos, y hay muchos latinos, y es otro ambiente, son otras experiencias, es otra mirada, es otro punto de vista, and I think that's what makes Sandra's work so great and so interesting, and such a different point of view that we haven't read as much.
Yeah, well, you know, I didn't realize that when I was writing it. I was just trying to tell stories that I thought, who would believe I'm sleeping here or I'm sleeping there? You know, because I didn't believe it myself. It's like a movie when you when you live these experiences, and then you have no one by the time you come home, and people say, "Hey, how was your trip?" And in my family, they ask the question, but then they turn around before you give the answer. That's how it is in my family. So I said, what do I do with these stories? They're so wild. I could not have invented them. And, you know, with the confidences that people gave me, you know, everywhere I went, women told me incredible stories of their misadventures, you know, in Paris or in their lives. And, you know, they just broke my heart. I want to say, just hug them and say, oh, honey, no. And there was nobody to hug me when I was living these things. So I just gathered them, and that's what fiction is good for, you know, you throw it in.
Yeah, and you contrast it so well with what your family thinks is happening, that you're like having this fine life and drinking champagne, and it's like, no, not at all.
It's like actually, I lived like a Charles Dickens, a Christmas story.
Mirando por la ventana todo lo que está pasando y todo lo que no puedes comprar.
Hungry and Cold in Paris. That could be another title for this story. Yeah.
And yet, you know, at the end, even though there's that level of sadness, there's also a wonderful window into the future. And it reminded me, me recordó, I'm gonna pull something out and I don't know, remember this book?
Yes.
Is that you?
Yes.
¿Eres tú? A ver, pero el poema que tienes aquí al fin, tantas cosas asustan, tantas, que me gusta tanto. Y el final de las últimas estrofas de ese poema. El amor asusta igual la luna y los generales y pesan mucho. No uno por uno, pero todos juntos, como una lata de canicas. La felicidad, al contrario, es otro asunto. Tiene que ver con los papalotes. And that image, you know, of the kites, all of a sudden, you know, things that were weighing down, and there's this burst, there's this release. And I kind of felt the same thing about the book at the end of the book. Not to give much away, but there was that. So you didn't leave us sort of in a state of sadness, but also in a state of, well, you know, this is a journey, es una jornada, y seguimos adelante.
I forgot that poem. I forgot all about it. And it's one of the few poems, maybe the only poem from that epoch in my life that I wrote in Spanish. So thank you for reading it out loud. I like it when you read it out loud. It just, you know, because now I've just finished a collection of poetry, and Liliana has to help me proof my Spanish, because a lot of them are coming out in Spanish, but I make a lot of mistakes. But fortunately, Liliana's within a phone call or an email away. And I hope that people feel at the end of this book that it's not sad. You know, I began from, as like I always do with my fiction, from autobiographical emotions, and then the stories take me to the stories of people I love. And I just know so many people who wound up like Corina at the end of the story. And I don't want to give it away, but I don't see it as a sad story at the end. I see it as one of an illumination. And I hope the readers will see it that way too.
¿Y qué piensas tú, Liliana?
Yeah, I think Corinne, yeah, not to give it away, but she finds her own journey and feels satisfied with her life, and like she finds herself, that maybe she was chasing an idea of what she thought she had to be or could be. Pero al final descubre que está bien, que su vida resultó bien, aunque no era tal vez lo que soñaba cuando era joven, pero todas esas experiencias todavía están con ella y tiene una vida interior muy rica.
Mhm.
You know, because she's still reading like these weighty books and interesting books and appreciating beauty in the small things and in the everyday. So it's still martyr. Todavía está con ella y es un artista en su corazón que
Sí,
sigue viendo todo así.
sí, tienes razón. Y también quiero decir que la vida y la realidad, a veces tenemos unos anhelos, unos sueños que algo nos va a tocar, el destino nos lleva a otro lugar, pero también es algo muy bonito y muy brillante, pero no es lo que uno esperaba en su juventud. You know, I think that's how life is. You know, you expect something and you get something just as brilliant, if not better, but it wasn't what you saw for yourself sometimes.
Right. But these characters, I mean, these characters were, despite the fact that we saw them sort of stumbling their way as young women, we recognize that all that experience is what allows them later to sort of come to terms with their stage in life and where they end up, right? So it's something to be said of. So I think that the book is also a celebration of that experience where we do kind of sometimes move blindly, you know, through our lives without, you know, resources, without information, without knowledge of or ways of being in the world, especially a young Latina who was sheltered, comes from a sheltered space. Y ese riesgo es parte del camino.
Sí, pero la gente no espera de que si vienes de clase obrera, de una casa de clase obrera, que puedes ser la más princesa de las princesas y más inocente, ¿no? Porque yo siempre he dicho que sigo siendo la más inocente persona que conozco. I'm like the biggest innocent and the most naive person even now. But you know, people don't expect that you could be coming from like a real hardcore neighborhood and be very sheltered and protected as my protagonist and someone else I know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Liliana, can you quería que hablaras un poco de unas decisiones que hiciste en la traducción. Me interesa mucho eso de la traducción.
Sí, sí, pues fue una novela que fue muy bonita, un reto porque es muy políglota, ¿no? O sea, not only do we
¿Cómo
have
se
the
dice?
usual
¿Cómo se dice?
políglota.
I never heard that in Spanish. That's beautiful, huh? Polyglot, políglota.
Yeah, the accent falls on a different syllable.
Qué curioso, qué bonito.
Políglota y cosmopolita.
Ay, tú.
Pues sí, so that was an extra challenge because, you know, Sandra's books are always challenging because of the code switching and the Spanish in the English, but this one had extra layers of challenge porque también, you know, it had the Mexican-American, the Mexican speech, but also French, Italian, and that kind of broken speech that when you travel and you're trying to communicate with people and you know a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and you somehow meet in the middle. So it's not smooth, it's not elegant, but you understand each other. And so you capture that so well in your book, in the original. And it was funny that there's a lot of humor in how you portray their dialogue. So el reto para mí en español, it was like, how do I put that in the other languages with just a touch of these other different languages, not in exactly the same place, but to give that taste, you know, especially with Argentine, using Argentine Spanish. That was a challenge. I had been in Argentina a couple of years ago at this Congreso de la Real Academia in Córdoba for a Royal Academy language event that I was invited to. And so I got to hear for the first time Argentine Spanish in real life. And that was so much fun because it has so much Italian in it.
Yes.
And things finally click for me like, oh, wow, that's why they speak the way they speak. Also their mannerisms and especially the Porteño accent that's so marked. And so I did the best I could. And then we had the help of Maria Belen, the jeweler in San Miguel, to check and make sure, we were on the right track. And then the editorial team at Vintage, who also came to our rescue. So that was fun because I had to put on these different hats of like, how would I speak? How would I say this if I was like a, full-blown Argentine or an Italian trying to speak a little bit of English, a little bit of Spanish, a little bit of French, and not make it too much. We were going back and forth with Sandra, like, is this too much, too little? Esto no suena bien, esto mejor hay que cambiarlo.
Tengo que añadir también que tuve que encontrar mis amigos argentinos aquí en San Miguel de Allende y pedirle el favor de venir y grabar las frases para que yo podría aprender cómo pronunciarlos, porque como yo hice la grabación al español, esta vez tú no lo hiciste, Lili. Sí. Tuve que hacerlo yo por ser chicana. Y la verdad que practiqué con las grabaciones de un chavo y una chava aquí que son porteños. Eso me ayudó muchísimo. So I was practicing, by borrowing a couple of Argentine friends that I made come over here in my hometown and tape them. And the story.
For the audiobook, for the audiobook that's available in English and Spanish right now.
But I had to read except for the letters, I had to read, all the other characters. I had to learn how to get the voices down, and I had to be the father, and I had to be Richard, and I had to be the two Argentines, and I had to be the Peruanos and the metro stop. I had to do everything. It was like being on a radio play, and it was fun. But I practiced out loud so much that Eunice, who cooks for me, she heard me saying, "Ay, Pufina, I know Pufina, no Pufina." She heard it so much that our new puppy is now named Pufina.
No, I mean, it's a really rich, really textured novel, and so many dialogues and speech and registers of language.
Creo que se presta para una obra dramática, me di cuenta porque lo ensayé con una actriz, and it's just long enough for what the pompis can sit for an hour and a half, and sit for an hour and a half. That's what I think is like what a play should be, what your butt can withstand. And it really works really well out loud. I learned that practicing and working with actors, and I think it'll be very nice if somebody runs with it and takes it as a play.
Definitely, yeah.
Quiero preguntarte sobre París. ¿Por qué París fue el perfecto lugar para este cuento?
Pues, ¿tú crees que yo sé cosas así? I don't know.
Ay, tú
saber esas cosas. Yo no pienso cuando escribo, además escribo de las cosas que me hacen sentir incómodas. The things that stories don't come out of my head like Athena, they come out of my heart from like a very fine nopal spine that is there irritating me. And for me, it always usually comes from some place that is, I can't even name what emotion it is. And I don't even know what genre it wants to be. But it's a way of deshaciéndome from this irritating, is it a nopal spine or a grain of sand, or I don't know. That's how I always begin. And I never know where it's going to take me. I was just flabbergasted at where that trip took me to, and the emotions I felt, the people I met, and some that are still friends of mine and some that I've never heard from again. And the clarity that I was seeking for what I felt for them is what led me through this story.
Yeah. Well, I think it was the perfect choice, whether or not, how conscious you were of that, because as Paris is a city that is where all these lives converge and disconnect, and also the contrast between the glamour the external life that Paris has in the imagination, right? And then this young woman or young women sort of entering that space and trying to find their place in this incredible landscape.
Well, I'm glad that it resonated for you, Lily, with your trips and some of the stories you've told me about traveling alone as a Mexicana. And believe it or not, on this trip, I was not 20, I was 28, turning 29. I had just finished House on Monmouth Street on November 30th. In 1982, I was 28, and my birthday was the next month. And I spent my birthday on a train, but I did meet 2 Mexican women traveling alone and during this year of my voyaging. And even that was 2 more than I expected to find.
Yeah. Liliana, how about you? What do you think about Paris as the setting for this novel? And
Yeah, I think it's perfect because it's so evocative, and like all writers at some point want to go to Paris and maybe to New York. It's like the 2 main destinations, right? Like so romantic. But yet in reality, it can also be not very romantic. When you're in some attic room because that's all you can afford, and you're freezing, and you're trying to take a bath, a sponge bath, and in front of this rickety heater like Sandra describes that stinks of this petroleum or butane, whatever it is, and it's kind of dangerous because it could also catch fire. So it's like the most unglamorous setting, and yet there's all this beautiful, amazing sights, like when they go to the market and they're looking at all the little cositas and the food and the splendor. So I think it's a perfect setting.
Yeah, and there's so many associations, to Paris in literature, right? The everything from the flaneur, the traveler, but this one I think offers something very different, something quite compelling, porque en realidad, como decimos antes, esos cuentos de gente de bajos recursos no necesariamente se cuentan o se escuchan, ¿verdad? Y en fin, definitivamente en la literatura no los vemos mucho, ¿verdad? Esa experiencia.
But what else are you going to do with the stories that break your heart? But write about them, especially if the people that gave them to you are not writers.
Right. So wonderful. I mean, and I also want to touch a little bit on the other characters in this novel, especially the men, the musicians, and there was something, despite the fact that there was this thread of loneliness and sadness, there was also wonder, in this character as she moved through París. Había sorpresas por donde quiera, y creo que captó eso muy bien en el libro.
I hope so. Ojalá, no sé. I'm just pleased because you're a poet, and I just wondered how you would find this story. So tell me more, Rigoberto.
Pues me gustó mucho. Ya sabes que yo te diría que sí, no. Me gustó mucho el libro en realidad. And, I was in Paris in a very different period, a very different time. And yet I still, identify with a sense of isolation that you get, even in a place that's so welcoming, right? Creo que eso,
wait a second, did you say welcoming?
Yeah, in a place that could be welcoming,
Could
be welcoming, yeah. No, there's also hostility, ¿verdad? Pero in a place that's, la mitología de París, que dicen, aquí todo llega, todo se recibe, y en realidad esa no es la realidad de París.
No especialmente para los inmigrantes, ¿eh?
Claro.
Porque fíjate, tú dijiste que te reconocen a ti como un árabe,
Sí.
A mí también, así que, y esto fue en los años 80, así que imagínate.
Claro.
¿No?
Sí, todavía existe eso. Tienen nombres los franceses para árabes y también para africanos ahí. Y bueno, pero todavía sigue este movimiento. Los inmigrantes llegan, así como en cualquier otro lugar, claro. Estamos viendo ya lo que está desarrollando la frontera, ¿no? Esta nueva población. Y creo que eso es lo más importante de reconocer, de que esas historias todavía existen, todavía siguen.
Yeah, yes, exactly. And I hope that people reading this will think about what's happening right now on borders on all of the empire, of all of the colonial countries, including the United States and all of Europe. Yeah, I hope that people will read this as an immigrant story.
Yeah, and then the counterpoint to Paris is Chicago, because she's always saying, well, Chicago and Paris are almost on the same parallel. And
Excuse me, I'm gonna have to interrupt 1 second because I'm seeing I'm on low battery mode. I gotta go get the cord. So you keep
okay.
talking. Be right back.
Talking.
Alright.
Okay, Liliana.
Yeah, so Chicago, and when Corina, the main character, is describing how beautiful Chicago can be if you can sit by the lake and or go to the art institute, and there's so many beautiful places in the city. But if you live in a neighborhood far away and you have to take a couple buses, and by the time you get there, you're tired. And so it's like, I think Sandra makes the point that, yeah, many of these big cities are beautiful if you happen to have the money and live in the nice areas, because otherwise there's the other side, the underbelly of them.
Y el inmigrante siempre está lejos de casa y siempre anda buscando casa, ¿no? Buscando su lugar. Y creo que eso se comunica muy bien en esta novela. I want to remind everyone, if you have questions, to please paste them in the Q&A. Si tienen preguntas, por favor, ahí en Q&A para ahorita que regrese Sandra, ya que allá está Sandra arreglando los muebles. Está haciendo Sandra arreglando muebles. Ándale pues.
Los cables.
Este mugre. Ay, ay, ay.
Ingeniero Sandra.
Ay, ay, ay. Un momentito, ¿eh? Saved.
Saved by the bell. You see, I'm so happy that the books are traveling together in this beautiful edition. I just have to say that. And they're gonna go everywhere together. And this format is common in Mexico and Latin America, especially for children's books. And in the States, it's not very common, but so it's a novelty. But it's a fun idea, and I just want to give a shout out for the beautiful edition.
And look at this lovely like fold flap so that like it doesn't curl.
Exactly. Yeah, it's very nice. And then the different fonts, like the letters all have a different font. So aesthetically, it's just very pleasing and beautiful book.
I think it's called a French fold.
Right, yeah.
It is, right? It's called a fold. Al punto ahí. Bueno, vamos a ver unas cuantas preguntas porque creo que...
Okay, ándale.
A ver, agarro mis lentes que no
Glad
veo.
I noticed that I had left my computer open and didn't realize I had drained the power. But here I am. Thank you for keeping the conversation going.
Okay, so here is a comment. Did you ever question or consider what different forms the story would take? Or did the fragmented writing come immediately? And was it inspired or shaped by different things you've been reading in recent years, online writing or other stories and books?
I began this like 30 years ago and put it away. So I can't remember the first part that I wrote. Well, I know which pages, but I rewrote them later. But the very first section of the book that goes all the way to the time they're living in Paris and the New Year's Eve dance, that was the original part of the story. And I can't remember how I did that, except that I've always written buttons. House on Mungo Street is little buttons. And I always write, even within one larger story, I write them in little, what I call buttons, and then I move them around. This looks so structurally complex. If I had to think about it, I couldn't do it. All I did was I write little scenes, and I write like if I'm writing a poem. And, so that means when I move a syllable, the whole thing is ruined and I have to kind of rearrange it. And I read things aloud a lot. I was thinking a lot in this novel of writers that I admire very much. And the people that are women that are writing over 60. I was thinking of Jean Rees, favorite of mine, and Merced Rodoreda, and Maria Dermout, and Marguerite Duras. These are some of my favorite writers. And I think I especially Merced Rodoreda gave me permiso to do things in a very close to the body type of way. I think, if there's any one writer that I point to especially, it would be Merced Rodoreda.
Una pregunta para ti, Liliana. Says, I'm curious, what surprised you about Martita?
Yeah, I think I had maybe seen an earlier incarnation of this story many years ago, because it was originally part of the house, Arroyo de la Llorona, Woman Hollering Creek. I may have seen some earlier version. And then when I read this new version, I was surprised at the ending, without giving it away, that it took a turn where I was like, wow, I wasn't expecting that to go there. And with Corina's life and coming to terms with her life, as we were mentioning earlier. And I thought, well, that's good. That's fresh. It's because I think a lot of the stories that are inspirational and like My Brilliant Career, that movie that I think was also a book, Australian movie, and just or even Little Women, where you persevere and at the end you become this great, fabulous, famous writer, which Sandra has become. But her dreams came true. But
that. It just happened.
But then this character, her life takes a different turn, and is like, well, that's valid too, and that's honest, and that's real, and that's okay too. And it was very refreshing, and I think maybe it had to be till your more mature years now, where you could just make that departure and just let it go to wherever the story wanted to go at that point. I don't know how you feel about that, Sandra, if you agree with that assessment.
I always begin from some autobiographical place, and especially when I'm writing poetry. But when I write fiction, the characters take off and start saying things that I would not have said. And Corina really shocked me, when, there was a moment when they're in the attic painting their toes. And do you remember that moment?
Yes.
She said, oh, Martita, I don't know. I've never made love. And I was like, what? That really shocked me. And, then, I realized, oh my, she's just on her own. This isn't like, I've created her from memory, but now she's taken off.
And what surprised you, Rigoberto? Because I think they also asked.
Yeah, well, for me, I actually, after I finished reading it, I really saw it as almost like an epilogue to a number of the beautiful essays that Sandra wrote for A House of My Own. I saw connections there.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, it gave a different kind of life for me for those essays that I'd read. And I think that's why this book just really seemed very powerful. This, it's a little book and just so powerful. Also, like Your House on Mango Street, the little book, but it has this amazing power. And I think that I saw the same thing here.
Yes. I feel like I did something between House on Mango Street and Caramelo. I made Caramelo on purpose, really huge. And I was influenced a lot by the Latin American boom male writers. And, I was I'm always experimenting. And this one, I wanted to try to stretch it and make a longer book. But, no matter how much I said, giddy up, it didn't want to go. It wanted to be what it's wanted to be. And I just said, okay, I knew enough not to force it. And I so it is what it is, but I feel like it's got the succinctness of House, but a density of characters from Caramelo. So I'm especially proud of this book. It's my favorite book to date.
Okay. Thank you. What I hear. Okay, so somebody wants some writing advice. They ask, on the topic of writing, what advice would each of you give to someone who wants to write but doesn't quite know where to start?
Oh, Lily, start.
Yeah, I think I would paraphrase you to say write about the things you want to forget. That you wish you could forget, that have that emotional power, and there's something in there, and they're scary, but there's something true to your life experience that maybe you don't want to look at, but you can't get rid of either.
Yeah, and I think that the writer definitely has that, and it reminded me, Sandra, of one of the essays in a place called Home, where I think you're interacting with your brother, I think, and the brother says to you, how did you remember that? And your response was, how could you forget? Right? And I thought, well, there's a difference. There's a difference between somebody who's gonna, definitely let it go, and somebody who's gonna use that, to get somewhere else. And definitely to the power of writing to try to untangle that, try to untangle that and reckon with it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what advice would you give, Rigoberto?
Definitely read, leer. That's the best thing. I mean, even now, when I feel like a little, I'm not going to get myself to the desk, I just go back to my favorite books. I pick up a book and I start reading, and I remind myself, that this is what I want to do, and this is how it's done, and there's such magic in writing, and there's such beauty in writing. And after that, I can't turn away from the desk, because I'm like, well, this is what I want to do. I want to contribute to this. So reading is what inspires me to get back to it.
And I have bedside books too. Liliana's last poetry book is there. Your new poetry book is there. Rigoberto. I like to wake up, and I really can't move in the morning. I literally can't move because I have like 4 dogs sleeping on top of me. I don't start out the night with 4 dogs, I have to tell you, but it ends up that way in the morning. So I'm kind of pinned, and I reach for poetry, because I think if we all read poetry, before you became vertical, we would all be better human beings. And I like to have the poetry books there, because they kind of are like a prayer. They are a dialogue. They remind me what matters. And the most important thing, I like to have the poets next to me that make me want to run for my pen. I want to get inspired. So one of the things I would say is to have books that make you feel like writing, that give you permission to write. And sometimes the 50 greatest books that a big publishing house recommends aren't going to do it for people who are marginalized. I felt a lot of times that books that came to me too early, weren't the right books for me. And I've had to dig around the rubble to find the books that inspire me. And if you want to see some of those, I post them on my Instagram. They're an article that I did recently for Buy the Book. And, there's many things that I'm reading, but I'm going to reiterate what you both are saying, write about the things you wish you could forget, and read writers that give you permission to speak.
Yes. I remember, as a young reader, of course I read all the classics. Of course, they took me to worlds that I unfamiliar and wonderful. But then when I read, the poetry of Francisco Alarcón, or the poetry of Rigoberto Rios, or the wonderful book by Sandra Cisneros, it changed the way that I felt. I finally felt closer to this thing called a writer. I wanted to be a writer, but there was always this distance, like, well, the writer is that kind of person who has that kind of world experience, who has that kind of access. But it was reading, these incredible writers who were much closer to me than I thought I'd ever be to writers. And I think that that's what, again, opened the door for me, definitely.
Yes. And libraries, so important that we have, if you're going to be a writer, you have to have a library card. That's your university.
Mm-hmm. There's a question here. It says, in what ways do you alter or edit yourself because you think it's too much for the reader? And I think this has to do with, what we as, or what you as a writer hold back, or do you, when you're, for example, this Martita story.
I don't hold back. If I feel uncomfortable, I know go there. And sometimes I really feel like, is that too much information? I don't hold back. I rely on my editors, my publishing editor, and my personal editors, my friends who are writers reading my work, and you'll see their names in acknowledgements, to, if there's some confusion or problem, they'll tell me. But I'm not a person that wants to shock anyone. But I know that when I write, there's so many things I'm ashamed about. And I think my whole life has been one of conquering that emotion of shame, whatever it may be about. And usually for me, my taboo subjects have to do with memories or things that I'm ashamed to remember or say out loud.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we have one more question. And the question here is, how do you both feel about these new writers contributing to the collective Latinx, Chicanx voices? And do you have any current favorites, either books or, okay, whatever, either books, okay, ya perdí the, yeah, so how do you feel that the new generation of writers? Ya perdí what happened to my question here? I thought I had it here, no, it disappeared.
Well, isn't it, who do we like?
I guess it's who do we like, but also the what's our response to this new generation? We're continuing the journey, which is great. I mean, we definitely want the bookshelves to expand, right? Maybe we should say who we like, because people get mad when you don't, if you leave them out. But maybe you can.
Yeah, I have favorites. There are people I really like. I like Joe Jimenez in San Antonio. I like Jaime Cortez, whose new book Gordo just came out a lot. And I love Cristina Granados in El Paso, and John Olivares from Southern California. Those are just some of the ones that I'm reading. I'm always reading somebody's book. I'm looking at Javier Zamora's new memoir right now. And, I've always got things in manuscript form that I'm reading. So those are a couple of names that I like. I'll think of some more later and say, oh, I should have mentioned.
Yeah, but it's important, right? Because then it makes us, that was always the goal. The goal was always to have more, to grow, have, it can't just be, all our stories are valuable, but at the same time, you don't want us to be the only voices. I mean, that's why these voices existed in the first place, to invite others, into that community.
But, I want to add, that's Generation X. There's other people that are older whose work isn't known because of the genre they publish in, or because they write in Spanish, or whatever reason. And those are writers that I admire too. And Tammy Gomez in Fort Worth, Liliana Valenzuela in Austin. And there are writers who are my age or older whose work we don't know. And that's important to recognize them as well.
Liliana, what do you add to that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of interest and ferment and new voices, which is really exciting. And I think so many of them will say they were inspired by Sandra, Cisneros, and the House of Mango Street. I mean, it really was like a watershed moment that inspires so many young people, and I want to acknowledge that and celebrate that. So many generations have found their voices because of you. And also you, Rigoberto, and all your works, and the creation of different spaces for those voices to be heard, including the Macondo Writers Workshop, which you founded around your kitchen table. Then there's other organizations like Canto Mundo for poetry, Latino poetry, Latinx. And there's also this podcast called Hablemos Escritoras podcast, of which I'm a contributor. We just recorded an interview with Sandra that's going to appear in Spanish, porque en Latinoamérica todavía mucha gente no ha conocido tu obra, como en Argentina, Perú, Bolivia, incluso México, algunos lugares. Hay gente que
Especialmente
todavía no te conoce y que te debe conocer y que ya te va a conocer porque ya va a salir en la casa de Mango Street en español el
Gracias.
año que entra. Y and that is like a great resource because it has an encyclopedia, it has podcasts. Some of the podcasts are in English, some mixed, like we've been talking today, others in Spanish, many in Spanish, and there's a wealth of women writers from Latin America and Spain. A lot of their work is being translated into English, and I've just had the opportunity to read and to interview some amazing writers.
Thank you so much. Creo que ya se nos acabó el tiempo. Un placer hablar con ustedes dos. En realidad, este libro muy impactante, muy importante. Me alegro que ya lo hemos recibido y seguimos en diálogo con este libro tan maravilloso. Gracias, Sandra. Gracias, Liliana.
Gracias a ti, Rigo. Gracias,
I have
Sandra.
to do a Maria Collins.
And gracias, Center for Fiction, for inviting us.
Yes, thank you for the diálogo y ánimo. I feel so excited talking to you both. Muchos thank yous.
Thank you all. That was wonderful. And everybody, don't forget to purchase your copy if you haven't already. And thank you for joining us. And we'll see you all again soon.